Dubai once turned a point in the desert into a gateway influencing nearly 4.5 billion people. But in March 2026, that geographic advantage began to behave like a trap. As instability spread across Gulf airspace, disruption hit DXB, the airport that helped convert location into global leverage. Flight schedules fractured, confidence wavered, tens of thousands of routes were suddenly forced to adapt at the same time. And the pressure is not coming from only one direction. While authorities continue advancing a $35 billion expansion designed for even more traffic, newer ultra-long-range aircraft like the Airbus A350-1000 are quietly making traditional stopovers less necessary. For decades, global travel needed somewhere to land. Now the world is learning how to fly past the Middle East entirely. When movement changes, infrastructure built around permanence faces a different test. To understand how a quiet airstrip became one of the most critical junctions in aviation, and why that position may be shifting, we need to go back to 1960. In 1960, Dubai was not a global hub. It was barely a destination. The airport was little more than a compacted strip of sand stretching roughly 1,800 meters along the Gulf, a place where a handful of propeller aircraft could refuel before continuing toward Asia. No skyline, no financial center, no obvious reason for global traffic to stop here. But there was one overlooked detail: position. Within an 8-hour flight radius of Europe, Africa, and Asia lies a zone containing nearly 60% of the world's population. Geography alone did not create power, but geography combined with infrastructure created leverage, and Dubai began building before the real oil wealth even arrived. By 1965, the first asphalt runway signaled something larger than aviation development. It signaled intent to transform a refueling point into a control point. Because whoever influences the stopover does not just move passengers. They begin to influence the structure of global movement itself. And once traffic patterns start to reorganize around a single node, the next phase is no longer about location. It is about designing a system that makes alternative routes feel inefficient, which is exactly what began happening next. By the early 1980s, Dubai faced a structural limitation most global cities never encounter. It had no large domestic market to protect demand, no industrial base large enough to guarantee traffic, no natural reason for millions of passengers to begin or end their journey here. So the strategy evolved. If people did not need to come to Dubai, Dubai would make itself impossible to avoid. In 1985, with only $10 million in seed capital, the government launched Emirates, not simply as an airline but as a traffic acquisition mechanism. The objective was not scale at the beginning. The objective was control of flow. Aircraft began pulling passengers from fragmented regional routes and feeding them into a single transfer node. DXB expanded terminals not to serve a local population but to process continuous transit volume moving between continents. This created a powerful feedback loop. More routes increased connectivity. More connectivity increased dependency. More dependency made alternative paths feel less efficient. By 1999, passenger numbers had already reached 11 million. Not because Dubai became a destination first, but because it became a shortcut. And once enough global movement begins passing through one location, that location stops behaving like a city. It starts behaving like infrastructure the rest of the world quietly adjusts around. At that point, growth is no longer linear. It becomes self-reinforcing, and self-reinforcing systems rarely slow down voluntarily. Once the flow was captured, the next objective was not simply growth, it was inevitability. In 2008, while much of the global financial system was under extreme stress, Dubai opened Terminal 3, a $4.5 billion structure spanning more than 1.7 million square meters. At the time, it became one of the largest buildings on Earth, designed almost entirely around the operational needs of Emirates' wide-body fleet. Scale was no longer just capacity. Scale became a message. Every additional gate, every additional long-haul route, every additional wide-body aircraft signaled to the market that Dubai was not experimenting with aviation dominance. It was committing to it. By 2014, DXB overtook London Heathrow in international passenger traffic, reaching more than 70 million travelers annually. A hub that once existed only as a refueling stop had begun restructuring intercontinental mobility patterns. And something subtle started happening inside the industry. Airlines, logistics firms, and passengers began optimizing their own decisions around Dubai's network density. The hub was no longer reacting to global demand. Global demand was beginning to adapt to the hub. But systems that scale this quickly often develop a hidden dependency. They must continue scaling. Because when infrastructure is calibrated for constant expansion, stability itself begins to rely on uninterrupted growth. And uninterrupted growth rarely remains uninterrupted forever. By the 2020s, Dubai International was no longer just a hub. It was a precision instrument. In 2023, DXB processed 86.9 million passengers with operational accuracy approaching 99.8% baggage reliability, a level of synchronization where delays in one corridor could cascade across continents. By 2025, traffic reached 95.2 million passengers, reinforcing its position as the busiest international airport in the world for over a decade. At this scale, efficiency stops being a competitive advantage. It becomes an operating assumption. Around 27% of Dubai's GDP had become linked to aviation and aviation-adjacent activity, supporting roughly 630,000 jobs. A dense network of 291 destinations served by more than 100 airlines created a system optimized for continuous throughput where aircraft rotations, passenger transfers, cargo flows, and retail consumption operated with minimal idle capacity. But optimization has a side effect. The tighter the system becomes, the smaller the margin for deviation. Infrastructure designed to operate near full capacity performs exceptionally under stable conditions. Yet the same precision reduces flexibility when conditions change unexpectedly. And by the time a system reaches peak efficiency, adaptation often becomes slower than disruption. Which means the next shock does not need to be large, only mistimed. In March 2026, the stress test arrived, not as a gradual slowdown, not as a cyclical downturn, but as an external disruption targeting the most sensitive layer of the system, trust in uninterrupted movement. As geopolitical tension intensified across the Gulf, airspace risk perception shifted almost instantly. Insurance costs adjusted. Flight paths recalculated. Airlines began reducing exposure before formal restrictions were even introduced. Then the chain reaction accelerated. Fuel infrastructure vulnerability triggered operational constraints. Schedule reliability deteriorated. Network synchronization weakened. Within weeks, nearly 37,000 flights were canceled or rerouted, forcing the world's most optimized transit hub to operate far below design capacity. A system calibrated to run continuously at near maximum throughput suddenly had to function with broken timing. And timing is everything in hub economics. Missed connections multiply exponentially. Aircraft rotations misalign. Crew logistics destabilize. Passenger confidence erodes. The visible disruption was measurable in cancellations. The invisible disruption was happening inside decision models across the aviation industry. Because once airlines begin adapting route structures under uncertainty, reverting to previous patterns becomes a strategic choice, not an automatic outcome. And strategic choices rarely ignore newly discovered vulnerabilities. Airports move aircraft, but hubs depend on confidence. As images of disruption circulated, the reaction did not begin in terminals. It began in capital allocation models. Risk premiums adjusted. Insurance costs climbed sharply. Route profitability assumptions changed in real time. For global carriers, uncertainty is not theoretical. It is priced immediately. War risk insurance premiums surged, eroding already thin margins on long-haul routes passing through the Gulf. Aircraft utilization strategies shifted. Some airlines began reallocating capacity toward alternative hubs where geopolitical exposure appeared more predictable. And capital rarely waits for official confirmation. Reports indicated tens of billions in private wealth began repositioning toward jurisdictions perceived as more stable. Private aviation demand spiked as high-net-worth individuals prioritized optionality over loyalty. Real estate markets, previously supported by continuous inflows of expatriate capital, showed signs of sudden softness. Dubai's economic architecture had always relied on external participation. Foreign investors, foreign workforce, foreign transit demand. When external confidence hesitates, internal momentum alone cannot fully compensate. Because globalization concentrates opportunity, but it also concentrates sensitivity to perception shifts, and perception can change faster than infrastructure can adapt. Even without geopolitical pressure, another shift was already weakening the hub logic. Range. Aircraft like the Airbus A350-1000 are extending nonstop capability across distances that previously required intermediate stops. Routes once considered commercially impractical are becoming viable as fuel efficiency improves and airlines seek to reduce complexity in volatile environments. Every additional kilometer of range reduces the structural necessity of transit nodes positioned between continents. For decades, geography forced intercontinental travel to fragment into segments. Passengers moved step by step, transferring through strategic junctions such as Dubai, Doha, or Istanbul. The stopover was not a preference, it was a constraint. Technology is dissolving that constraint. Sydney to London, Singapore to New York. Direct connections that bypass traditional hubs entirely are no longer symbolic demonstrations of engineering capability. They are becoming part of competitive network design. And once airlines begin building fleets optimized for fewer stopovers, hub dependency weakens quietly but persistently. Because hub dominance was never only about luxury terminals or passenger experience, it was about necessity. When necessity fades, influence must be re-earned under new conditions, which means the challenge facing Dubai is not only recovery from disruption, it is adaptation to a world where structural advantage is becoming less structural. For more than half a century, Dubai succeeded by positioning itself where global movement had little choice but to converge. Geography created opportunity, infrastructure amplified it, optimization defended it. But structural advantage is never permanent. When geopolitical friction alters perceived safety and technology simultaneously reduces the need for intermediate stops, the map itself begins to loosen. Routes that once curved naturally through the Gulf start experimenting with alternatives. Network resilience becomes more valuable than network density. Flexibility begins competing directly with scale, and scale is slow to pivot. Mega infrastructure requires long planning cycles, fixed capital, and predictable flows, but aviation demand can reorganize faster than physical assets can adapt. Airlines continuously recalculate route efficiency. Insurers continuously recalculate exposure. Investors continuously recalculate jurisdictional stability. The result is subtle at first, not collapse. Rebalancing. Traffic redistributes incrementally. Capacity shifts gradually. Influence diffuses quietly across multiple competing hubs, which creates a strategic dilemma. Because a system optimized to dominate a previous configuration of globalization must now adapt to a configuration that is still emerging. An adaptation at this scale is never instantaneous. It unfolds while the rest of the world keeps moving. Dubai's rise was never an accident. It was a calculated conversion of geography into leverage, infrastructure into influence, and transit into economic gravity. Few modern cities have demonstrated how quickly a peripheral location can reposition itself at the center of global systems. But systems built on continuous flow inevitably face moments when that flow changes direction, not necessarily permanently, but meaningfully. DXB does not need to disappear to lose structural dominance. It only needs the world to discover viable alternatives. Because once alternative pathways become normalized, global movement rarely returns to a single preferred corridor. The real uncertainty is not whether Dubai can recover passenger volume. It is whether the conditions that once made the hub indispensable still apply in the same way. Global connectivity continues to expand. But expansion does not always preserve the same centers of gravity, and in network economics, relevance is never guaranteed by past performance. It is continuously renegotiated by technology, risk perception, and shifting patterns of trust. Dubai transformed a quiet airstrip into a global junction in just a few decades. The next phase will reveal whether that junction remains essential or simply one of many possible routes across a world that is constantly recalculating its path.